Now the bark on this slab is mostly removed, but if you had a slab with really heavy bark, you're better off using a chisel to remove it. This step is insanely dusty, so you'll notice that we set out our DIY air filter on top of our bench to try to collect as much dust as possible, even though we were still wearing our dust masks. This 80 grit flap disc threw dust all over the place. We tried using the shop vac hose to catch some of the dust, but it really didn't do a whole lot. Now if it wasn't 10 degrees outside, we definitely could have done this outside of our shop, but sometimes you just have to get dirty. The key here is to let the flap disc do all of the work. Don't put much pressure down, as you can risk gouging the wood, or even worse, having the disc get caught in the wood and the angle grinder getting ripped out of your hand. Once all of the bark was removed, there were still some rough spots that were left from the flap disc, and we needed to sand those smooth. Mandy thought it would be a good idea to try to sand it by hand, but she eventually realized that she was going to be out there all night unless she switched to a random orbit sander. And this slab had some fairly good warp to it, so we desperately needed to flatten it. It'd be sweet if we had some industrial size equipment, but we don't, and you probably don't either. So we're going to flatten the slab the same way we did our pallet wood herringbone coffee table. Oh, you haven't seen that? Well, check out this video up in the cards above because that project is awesome. Anyway, we ripped down 2 pieces of scrap plywood that were ever so slightly taller than the thickness of our slab. We then clamped them down to our DIY mobile workbench. To hold the slab to our workbench while we flattened it, we used a little painter's tape and some super glue. What we're doing here is effectively making double-sided tape, so if you have any of that, feel free to use that instead. With the slab securely stuck to the table, the last thing that we needed to do is grab a couple shims just to make sure it didn't rock back and forth at all. We then grabbed our router flattening sled from the herringbone pallet wood coffee table project that we'll link to in the description below, and set it on top of our rails so that it'll slide back and forth perfectly over the slab. And here's the part of the project where we get real with you. I really screwed the project up here by trying to save a few bucks and get the world's cheapest router bit. I got home from work before Miranda did this night, so I wanted to get started to work on this table before she came home and we sat down for dinner. On the very first pass, the router just barely touched the far side of the slab, and cut alright, but really not great. On the second pass, you can see the bit was actually burning the wood and catching it a lot. I tried adjusting the feed rate, depth of cut, router speed, and width of cut, but literally nothing worked, even when we were only trying to remove about a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch at a time. You can actually see the smoke building up in the shop when the footage is sped up, but I really couldn't notice in real time since I was wearing a respirator and that completely blocked out the smell. Well, Miranda came home, opened the door, and said the burning smell was so bad outside, not to mention a small bit was actually ripped off the router bit. So yeah, this is the cost of trying to save a few dollars on a cheap router bit. We used it on the pallet wood table, so this wasn't brand new, but that wood was a lot softer. Needless to say, don't skimp on router bits. It's really not worth it. Luckily, the Amazon truck was in warp speed mode, and we heard everyone's favorite knock on their door, and we had a new bit in our hand and could not wait to get back at it. This new bit worked way better since it was nice and sharp. Here's a better angle of how the sled actually works. As the router runs across it, it removes a small amount of material that is perfectly parallel with the sled that's running above. And if you'd like to see more mistakes that we will inevitably make in all of our future projects, make sure to hit that subscribe button below. We put out a new project every Friday, and you definitely won't want to miss what we have coming up. Thanks. So it probably looks like we made a lot of dust to flatten the top, but just wait until we get to the bottom done. You're absolutely required to wear a respirator or dust mask while doing something like this. Now that one side of the slab is flat, we flipped it over and began the whole process again on the underside. We also have our DIY air purifier running underneath our bench, and I can tell you that it made a huge difference in the air quality compared to last time we used the flattening jig. Just check out the comparison for yourself up above. Unless you have some super long router bit, you'll likely reach a point where your router can no longer plunge down into the wood. At this point, we unclamped our rails from the workbench and ran them through a table saw to remove about 1/4 inch of material to effectively lower the router sled down. And then we continued on with the flattening. So by now, you're probably sick of seeing us flatten the slab, so we'll cut forward to the end. Yes, there is a piece of wood under that pile of dust, and this is why we tell you to wear a respirator. There is so much dust everywhere. Now I know what you're going to ask. 6 gallons. That's the answer. Pretty much any flattening jig is going to leave small lines where the router bit ran across. We want to quickly remove them as it will make the next step go much smoother. So we grabbed an orbital sander and knocked them down. With the sanding done on both sides, we spent some time making sure to vacuum up as much dust as possible to prep for the epoxy pour. You can see how much sawdust is hiding in all the cracks, and all of this desperately needs to be removed. Also, if there are any loose knots, grab a chisel or screwdriver and knock all of those pieces off. Now, since this slab is ash, there are inevitably a lot of small bug holes in the wood, and you could fill all of them with epoxy, but since they're so small, you probably wouldn't even see that color. The quick solution, super glue. Just fill each hole with a little bit of super glue and then spray some activator on to instantly cure the glue. This will stabilize any sawdust that's inside and prevent epoxy from potentially leaking through. Speaking of leaks, the next thing we need to do is tape the underside of the slab. We're using sheathing tape here to cover all the cracks so that when we pour the epoxy, it doesn't just leak through the table and all over the floor. We've seen horror stories about tiny leaks causing big issues, so we spent some extra time and, probably went a little overboard. Now, since epoxy needs to be room temperature and our shop is about 15 degrees Fahrenheit, we set up a steam from Dexter on our dining table. We made a little bit of a moat around the table just because we were paranoid about any potential epoxy leakage. And just to make sure the epoxy would cure level, we threw some shims underneath to dial in the perfect setting. We mixed some 2-to-1 epoxy and added some purple pigment to give it a little pop of color, and then poured the epoxy in these small little condiment type bottles that we found at the dollar store. Just make sure to cut the tip off before you start using them.
I think I gotta cut the tip of these. Yeah, nothing coming out. We cut mine too.
Yeah, I know, I did the exact same thing on the concrete table. We applied epoxy to all the cracks and voids in the slab. And some of the cracks go all the way through the slab and they're super thick and they just kept sucking up the epoxy. But this isn't a deep pour product, so we just filled them up about halfway and then we'll get them on the next pour. Now this is our first slab project, and the first thing that we learned is that buying a slab that has a ton of super tiny cracks like this is a real pain in the... We definitely will be looking for slabs with way less defects next time. With the epoxy poured, we went over it with a propane torch to bring the bubbles to the surface. You can also use a lighter or a heat gun. Just make sure to do this because leaving little bubbles in the finished project will not be a good look. The next day, we removed the sheathing tape and were relieved to see that none of the epoxy had spilled out. Some of the cracks and voids went entirely through the slab, so without the tape, the epoxy would have been everywhere. We quickly sanded the bottom to remove any remaining adhesive and then tried to sand down the epoxy on the top. While this worked, it took a super long time and we didn't want to spend hours sanding and going through a million discs. So we brought out the router sled again and removed about a 32nd of an inch off the surface. We just barely went in the wood and we were able to remove all the epoxy in just a couple minutes. And one of our followers over on Instagram recommended that we use syringes to fill the voids in the slab, and while we waited on those to arrive on the Amazon truck, we moved to stabilizing the end grain. This process is even easier. Just wrap some tape around the end, making sure to cover all the cracks down the side, and pour a generous amount of epoxy in a little bucket you make. Don't be shy during this pour because you'll be shocked at the amount of epoxy that the end grain will soak up. And the next day we mixed up some more epoxy and filled the end grain on the other side too. I think that one of the things we completely underestimated about this project was just how much time we were going to have to wait before each individual step with waiting for the epoxy to cure. The following day our syringes showed up. We got this pack on Amazon for about $8 and it came with tons of syringes and different size needles. Let me tell you, these made a huge difference. It was so easy to push the needle to the bottom of the crack to make sure that it was filled all the way up from the bottom to the top. Plus, it made a significantly smaller mess for us to clean up later. And after another day, we came back and removed the sheathing tape off both ends, and they could finally get outside to build the table. And I think this is where most people think the start of the live edge slab project occurs. There's a lot of prep work. Now, I don't know why I continued to try to use the random orbit sander again to remove the excess epoxy, but after a few minutes I brought out the belt sander to remove all of the excess. It works a lot better, trust me. But once the rough sanding was finished, I grabbed the trusty random orbit sander again and sanded the whole slab up to about 120. So now that all that work is done, we can actually get to the fun part, which is bringing out the saws and cutting this thing up. Now, a live edge slab has a curve to it and doesn't have a flat reference line, so we're going to use a straight edge to make our own. That way we make sure that all of our cuts are based off of that line so the table is nice and level. It really doesn't matter where you make this line, just use something that you think will look good. We then trimmed off the bottom edge of the slab with our circular saw guided by a straight edge to remove all of that excess epoxy. Over at the table saw, we cut down a small piece of 1/4 inch plywood and glued a straight piece of scrap wood down to it. We're making a very DIY version of the track saw since we don't have the Festool version. And we're assuming you probably don't either. And to finish up this DIY track saw, we angled our circular saw to 45 degrees and cut off the remaining wood. This will give us a zero clearance line so we can see perfectly where the saw blade's going to cut. We marked out where we needed to cut the slab in half to make the waterfall effect, and lined the DIY track saw up to the marks. With everything clamped down, we started the nerve-wracking process of cutting the 45-degree miter. With a slab this thick, it's super important to take multiple passes with the saw to prevent any binding or burning. And we took about 5 passes, but honestly could have done more. Wow, you got a great eye. Yeah, that tiny gap was where I started to cut the miter on the wrong side. Just don't tell anybody. And with one of the sides cut, we flipped the track around to create the matching bevel. And to be 100% honest with you, this was pretty difficult doing it with the circular saw. It would be way easier if we had a real track saw. However, it's definitely doable. Just really take your time setting everything up and holding the saw really steady as you make that cut. On one of the edges of our slabs, we marked out a mortise that we want to cut in order to hold a floating tenon between the two pieces. Now this sounds really fancy, but you'll get it in a bit. This will reinforce the joint and make it much stronger than just glue alone. And to connect the two pieces together, we need to whip up another super quick jig over on the table saw. So we angled our blade to 45 degrees and then ripped a scrap 2x4 on both sides to make this sort of triangular looking piece. We attached the guide jig to the slab with a little bit of painter's tape and some super glue, and then dropped a 3/4 inch bit into our router and began creating the mortise on the edge of the slab. You can see here that the jig we whipped up provides a nice flat space for the router edge guide to follow to make a perfectly straight mortise. Just make sure to take a few shallow passes and not try to hog all of it out at one time. If you've made it this far, we'd really appreciate it if you hit that like button down below. It helps us get this tiny 216 subscriber channel out to more viewers. Also, if there's a certain project that you'd like to see us build in the future, leave us a comment below and we just might feature your comment in a future build video. Thanks! And with that mortise cut, we grabbed a scrap piece of wood and cut it down to fit inside. Now it doesn't have to be an exact fit here, we're just looking for something fairly close. We squeezed a healthy amount of glue into the mortise, making sure to spread it all around the joint, and then began the stressful process of gluing the two pieces together. I don't think the amount of glue here can really be overstated, so just go wild. We made some angled glue clamping blocks to help hold the joint together and let the table rest overnight. The next morning we removed the clamps and we're pretty satisfied with how it came together. Just due to the curve of the slab, there were a few parts that needed to be blended together, so we brought out the angle grinder again to blend it all. This thing is still easily the best $5 tool that we've ever picked up. Just be careful not to press too hard and really misshape the slab. So take your time and it will work out perfectly. Now you might remember that we never removed the epoxy off the other edge of the slab. So we wanted to blend this in with the rounded look of the rest of the table, and we used our angle grinder to shape this area too. This was a lot of fun, but also super dusty. Miranda ran to the home center on her way home from work and picked up some 3/4 inch black iron pipe to make up the legs. And for some reason, the stuff comes absolutely covered in grease, so we wiped all the pieces down with some acetone before building the leg structure. With the acetone dried from the surface of the legs, we sprayed on some hammered matte black paint to give the legs a real nice look. Now my tip for spray painting is to do super light coats. This will prevent any drippage and give you a real nice surface finish. And while the paint dried, we applied a few coats of wipe-on poly. Just watch that wood come alive. After all the paint and finish had dried, the last thing that we needed to do was attach the legs. We placed the legs where we wanted them, then marked out the location of all of the holes. We used our cordless drill to drill some small pilot holes to help guide the screws in and prevent any potential cracking. Just make sure to use a drill bit that's slightly smaller than your screws, and remember, don't go through your tabletop. That would be really bad. And with the holes drilled, we set the legs back over the holes and drove screws in to fasten everything together. And with that, this project was done. This was our first time ever working with a live edge slab, and we had a lot of fun. The one thing that we didn't expect was how long all the epoxy work was going to take. So, if I have one word of advice to give anybody out there is, when you're looking at slabs, don't get one that has a ton of cracks and voids in it. It's going to take way too long to stabilize all that stuff.